Angelina.
When talking about history, most of the time, great empires and kingdoms tend to take the spotlight, such as the Roman Empire, the Mongol Empire, the English and French empires, and even the Ottoman Empire. Thus, often great stories tend to be overshadowed by these Goliaths. In this video, we'll be talking about one such story, the story of Serbia, and how this modern-day conflict-ridden country came to be from its also conflict-ridden past. Serbia is located in the heart of the Balkans, characterized by valleys hidden among mountains covered in dense forests. 3,000 years ago, modern Serbia did not exist. Generally, this region was inhabited by Illyrian and Thracian tribes, which some countries still like to bring up anytime any discussion about the Balkans is going on. However, during the 4th century BC, the Greeks decided to spread out and subsequently ended up in the south of this territory. In the 2nd century BC, the Roman Empire started spreading to the Balkans and conquered most of the modern-day Serbia's territory. Serbia was then divided into 3 provinces within the empire, being Illyricum, Moesia, and Pannonia. During this time period, as well, 3 of Serbia's well-known cities came into existence. The first one being Singidunum, aka modern-day Belgrade, which was used by the Romans as a border settlement from which they would repel invading Germanic tribes and also train their troops. Another city formed here was Sirmium, aka Sremska Mitrovica, which in its day was considered to be the 4th largest city in the late Roman Empire, which is quite a feat for a city that now has barely over 40,000 inhabitants. And finally, Serbia's 3rd largest city, Niš, or in Latin, Nisus. However, much like 50% of marriages in the US, the Roman Empire days were numbered. In 285 AD, the Roman Empire split like my parents, and Serbia went to the Eastern Empire, now known as Byzantium. Evidently, in the 5th century, the Western Empire fell due to barbarian invasions. However, this was only the beginning of Serbia, as in the plains of Poland, a new tribe was getting ready to spread its wings and explore the world. That tribe being none other than the Slavs. With the end of the 6th century, the Balkans saw a new era, the one of Slavic migration into the region. During the 6th and 7th century, the Byzantine Empire saw conflict on 2 sides of its empire. On the northwestern side, it was fighting the Avar Khanate, and on the east side, it was fighting against the Sassanid Empire. The Avar Khanate consisted of great numbers of Slavs, so in 626, a great Avar army headed towards Constantinople, the capital of Byzantium. At the same time, the Sassanid navy also headed towards the Bosphorus Strait, as the 2 empires made an agreement to help each other in the conquest of Byzantium. However, the 2 were unable to penetrate the walls of the city and ultimately were unsuccessful in their conquest. With the defeat of the Avars, many Slavs started to settle in the Balkans. As the Byzantines were still preoccupied with fighting on their west, they weren't able to defend themselves from the oncoming Slavic tribes. Among these Slavic tribes were the White Serbs, a tribe that was located on the territories of Eastern Germany, Poland, and Czechia. In the 7th century, during the migrations, the White Serb tribe was divided among 2 brothers, where one decided to take half of the tribe and go down to Byzantium, where they would seek refuge from the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius. The emperor would give the Serbs land around Thessaloniki. However, many decided after all to head back home to their barbarian families. But after they crossed the Danube, they changed their minds and settled in Illyricum. Then in the 8th century, Serbia gained its first monarchic dynasty, the Vladimirović Dynasty. It's also worth mentioning that around this time, Serbia was getting Christianized. Many started merging their pagan beliefs and traditions with Christian ones. Eventually, this process would be intensified with the appearance of 2 Byzantine missionaries, Cyril and Methodius, who actively Christianized the Slavic population and introduced them with their own writing system now known as the Cyrillic alphabet. The The first ever known prince of Serbia was Vyacheslav Vlastimirović. During the reign of Vyacheslav, most if not all Serbs in the region were united under one dynasty. Originally, Vyacheslav saw the principality under the control of Byzantium. However, eventually Serbia gained its independence from the empire, while also managing to create an alliance with their ex-overlords. During this time, the Bulgarians saw rapid expansion in the peninsula as they conquered more and more territory under the Byzantines. For the first part of Serbia's existence, the principality had good relations with Bulgaria. However, in the 9th century, things escalated downwards like an alcoholic falling down stairs, and war emerged between the two. Initially, Bulgaria instigated first its aim to conquer Rashka. The Serbian army was in the beginning beaten by the Bulgarians. However, under the leadership of Vlastimir Vlastimirović, the Serbs were able to fend off the Bulgarians with medieval guerrilla war tactics. Then by the end of the 9th century, a peace treaty was signed and Serbia was able to keep existing. Then in the 10th century, war broke out again with the Bulgarians. This time Serbs were victorious against an initial attack. However, after recouping its military, Bulgaria led a stronger and harder attack on Serbia, which ended in the annexation of the principality. The then Prince of Serbia, Czaslav, ended up being taken prisoner by the Bulgarians and taken back to Bulgaria. Czaslav would then break out of prison and run back to Serbia, where he would attempt to free the country. However, he would end up dying on the Sava River. Bulgaria held over Serbian land for roughly 1 century, up until Byzantium kicked Bulgaria's ass and took over Serbia once more. But in the mid-11th century, Serbia once more gained its independence after it successfully managed to revolt against the Byzantines under the leader of Stefan Vojislav. Stefan Vojislav came onto the scene by starting up a Serbian revolt in the province of Duklja. Initially, the revolt was unsuccessful and Stefan would end up in prison in Constantinople. After 1 year of living under the great medieval prison conditions, Stefan would break out of prison and head back towards Serbia, where he would lead a second revolt against the Byzantines. As with the news of Stefan becoming free, many Serbs would join his revolt, which would ultimately end in Serbia becoming once more a principality. The final blow for Byzantines for Serbian independence was the Battle of Bar, where the Serbian army led by Stefan would ambush the Byzantines during the night, which ended in a decisive Serbian victory. After the death of Stefan, the princedom of Serbia would fall into the hands of Mihailo I. With Serbia becoming a newly born princedom once more, the country decided to improve ties with the Pope and the Normans, as the Byzantines weren't all too happy with the princedom seceding from the empire. During his reign, Serbia gained the title of kingdom as a result of Mihailo's improved relations with the Pope. After his death, Mihailo's son, Constantine Bodin, came onto the throne. When Bodin entered the stage, the country was already at war with the Byzantines. Thus, throughout most of his reign, the kingdom saw conflict. Under Bodin, Serbia was able to conquer the city of Dyrrhachum, aka modern-day Durrës, in Albania. As the Byzantines found themselves in political chaos, the city was ripe for the taking. The Byzantines were able to take back the city later on, but let's not talk about that. Serbia also established vassals in Bosnia, and during Bodin's reign, the First Crusade was taking place. Many crusaders went through Serbia, where the Serbs agreed to protect them and provide food and supplies for their cause. And at the beginning of the 12th century, Constantine Bodin kicked the bucket, which put the country into chaos. With the death of Bodin, Serbia became divided into 3 separate countries: Bosnia, Raška, and Duklja. Before Bodin died, he put Vukan Vukanović in charge of Raška, who then would go on to unify Serbian lands once more under the same flag. After Vukan came his descendant, Desa. Under him, Serbia became a Byzantine vassal. During his rule, Serbia tried creating stronger ties with other European states, however ended up ultimately failing and falling in the shadow of Byzantium after losing a war with them. Byzantium then ended up putting a guy known as Tihomir Zavidović onto the Serbian throne. Now, under a set of complicated circumstances, Tihomir ends up giving away his land to different family members, one of whom were none other than Stefan Nemanja. What then occurs is an event which I can only describe as the Serbian Game of Thrones, as barely even historians know what the hell went on. Either way, Stefan Nemanja emerges victorious and starts his own dynasty, known as the Nemanjić Dynasty. Fun fact, during this time, the arguably most important Serbian medieval literature piece was written, Miroslavljevo Evangelje, aka Miroslav's Gospel. As Stefan came to the throne, he accepted Byzantine rule and essentially rendered himself as a vassal of Byzantium. The first thing he did was then attack another Byzantine vassal known as Zeta because of a family feud, and Serbia was ultimately successful at this. A year after the conquest of Zeta, Byzantium decided to go to war with the Venetian Republic. However, things backfired for Byzantium as Hungary decided to step on Venice's side and the Holy Roman Emperor gave his blessings. This inspired Serbia to revolt against Byzantium once more, as Nemanjić expected Hungarian help, but that never came. Both Hungary and Venice stepped out of the war after some unforeseen circumstances, and Serbia was left alone to fight Byzantium. Ultimately, Nemanjić ends up surrendering to Byzantium and begging for forgiveness, which the emperor ends up giving him and leaving him in his position of power. After this, Serbia starts acting like a good vassal and helped out Byzantium in the wars in Anatolia. However, everything changed after the death of the Byzantine emperor. All of the Byzantine vassals, including Serbia, declared independence from Byzantium. In the middle of the chaos, Serbia once more decides to attack Byzantium and conquer Niš, Kosovo, Braničevo, Ravno, Duklja, and even Sofia. Hungary also joined in and took over Dalmatia. These conquests would eventually pave the path for Serbia's golden age. Meanwhile, at the same time this was going on, the Third Crusade was also taking part, as Jerusalem fell once more. A great army was forming in Western Europe, and was led by no other than the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. As the Crusader army was passing through Serbia, the two kings met at Niš, where Stefan asked Barbarossa to invade Byzantium. However, the emperor declined. Although the Crusaders declined Serbia's suggestion, ultimately they ended up invading Byzantium and found themselves besieging Constantinople. Funny how life works like that sometimes. This of course angered the Byzantines, which in turn resulted in them fighting back and reconquering the territory from Serbia once more, where Stefan suffered a great defeat at the Battle of South Morava. While Serbia lost the battle, it did not lose the war, and ultimately was able to take back its lost territory from the Byzantines and sign a peace deal. Now, while Stefan Nemanja was making Serbia great again, he could not do this forever, as he, like most of us filthy humans, is a mere mortal, and death was coming for him. Thus, to continue the dynasty, Stefan had three sons, Vukan, Stefan, and Rastko. The firstborn son was Vukan, who was characterized as independent and hot-headed. He was followed by Stefan, who was more patient and analytical. The last-born son was Rastko. While his two older brothers were interested in war and politics, Rastko had no such ambitions. Rather, he focused on faith. While his brothers were learning the ins and outs of fighting on the battlefield, Rastko was reading books on theology and devoting himself to God. Then, when Serbia's army was defeated in the Battle of South Morava, Rastko saw that as a sign from God that he was on the right path, and there was no gain from war, only suffering. After the defeat, Stefan Nemanja decided to build a monastery, now known as Studenica, where he was planning on being buried. This in turn made Rastko think about abandoning his life as a prince and becoming a monk. At this point of time, Rastko heard of a place known as Mount Athos, a holy place where monks left behind all material belongings and devoted themselves fully to serving the Lord. However, what Rastko wanted and what he could do as a prince was not up to him, as his father had other plans. As he reached the age of 15, Stefan Nemanja gave Rastko control over the province of Hum, where Rastko had his own castle and servants. Even though the young prince had everything the average woman on Tinder wanted, he felt empty and wanted nothing to do with this. Thus, at the age of 17, at one royal party, two monks from Mount Athos were in attendance. Rastko decided to run away with them to the monastery and leave behind his royal life. He told his family he was going out hunting and vanished. When the king heard of Rastko's disappearance, he rallied the troops to go and search for him. Eventually they found him at Mount Athos. However, while they were celebrating, Rastko baptized himself and became a monk under a new name, Sava. As Sava was now a monk, he finally found inner peace in his life. And during his time at Mount Athos, he wrote letters to his family encouraging them to join him. Eventually his father, the king of Serbia, Stefan Nemanja, caved in and joined him at the monastery. He abdicated the throne and baptized himself and took the name of Simeon. The two ex-monarchs then went on to spread the word of Jesus Christ. and the first thing they did was rebuild another monastery in the mountain, now known as Hilandar. The monastery would later on become an extremely important part of Serbian church and culture, as the monastery over time would become the biggest center of education, with becoming the first ever Serbian school of higher education and the biggest workshop of medieval literature. During his time as a monk, Sava would travel through Serbian lands, meeting people from all walks of life. In his travels, he would start the foundation of the Serbian Orthodox Church by building churches and schools. This would end up giving him the title of Saint Sava the Illuminator and the father of the Serbian Church, as his deeds enlightened the population of Serbia and gave them knowledge and spirituality rather than bloodshed. While the youngest of three brothers decided to abdicate the throne, the other two were still determined to rule over Serbia. While Vukan was the firstborn, he wasn't named by his father as the successor of the throne, rather his brother Stefan, due to him being married to a Byzantine princess, which would strengthen the relations between the two nations. Rather than getting the throne, Vukan gained the province of Duklja. Angered by his father, he declared himself as the king of Duklja, Dalmatia, Toplica, and Metohija. This would end up culminating in an armed conflict as the two brothers clashed over the throne of Serbia. As Serbia plunged into a civil war, Hungary decided to step in and support Vukan's claim for the throne and invade Serbia, which would end up in Vukan defeating his brother and taking the throne for himself. However, there was only one problem. Because Hungary helped Vukan take the throne, it saw itself as the overlord of Serbia, and Vukan as its subject. While Stefan was defeated, he was not killed. He went into exile in Bulgaria, where he gathered an army. Soon Bulgaria went to war with Hungary and won, which in turn made Serbia's rulers' legitimacy and prestige go down. After the war, Stefan marched back into Serbia and took over the throne as the rightful ruler of Serbia. With the unrest in the Latin Empire and Bulgaria, Serbia turned itself against Bulgaria and took over new territories. Later on, Bulgaria and the Latin Empire would attack Serbia in a coordinated attack. However, the attempt to invade the country was unsuccessful. Serbia was once more stable with Stefan on the throne, and Vukan in charge of the western Serbian territories under his brother. During this time, the Pope decided to give Serbia once more the title of kingdom. Right after that, Stefan and Sava started discussing creating their own Serbian church. Sava went to Nicaea and asked for permission from the Byzantine Emperor, which he was granted in the hopes that this would allow Serbia and Byzantium to create closer ties. Sava was then granted the title of Archbishop of all Serbian land. Shortly after that, Sava went to Mount Athos and gathered a bunch of his students, with whom he went back to Serbia and translated a lot of Greek literature into Serbian, such as the Nomocanon. Then he also wrote the first ever Serbian constitution, known as the Krmčija. After the Three Brothers Saga, Serbia was more or less in a peaceful and stable era. But like all good things, everything must come to an end. Serbia's new age dawned in the mid-13th century with the rise of King Dragutin, who violently overthrew his father Uroš with the help of Hungary. The people of Serbia were heavily displeased with this. Their satisfaction only grew with King Dragutin, as he would later go on and lose a war with Byzantium, and also break his leg in a horse riding accident, which many would see as a punishment from God for violently overthrowing his father. Because of this, Dragutin would go on and become a monk at the end of his life as a way to atone for his sins. After Dragutin came Milutin, who put Serbia on the path of war once more. Serbia joined a coalition against Byzantium, and in a medieval blitzkrieg bust through Byzantium and took over modern-day northern Macedonia. Byzantium organized a counterattack, however Serbia was once more able to repel the invasion. However, while Serbia was being victorious in the south, a storm was brewing in the northeast. The Mongol Empire was encroaching and Serbia laid right in its path. The Mongols penetrated Serbia like a policeman's bullet, an unarmed black man, and laid waste with everything they came in touch with. However, Milutin rallied the troops once more and was able to push back the Mongols back to Bulgaria. Peace was made with the Mongols, with a couple of royal marriages and captives given to each other as collateral. Meanwhile, in the west, with the dawn of the 14th century, so came the dawn of a new crusade, which once more was heading down the Balkans and straight for Byzantium. In an attempt to keep the country safe, Serbia negotiated once more with crusaders, and much like with the Mongols, was able to come to an agreement with a couple of royal marriages. While on the throne, Milutin also had a son named Stefan, who grew stronger and more popular by the people. and in the fashion of his grandfather, Dragutin, decided to take down his father and claim the throne of the country. However, unlike his grandfather, Stefan was unsuccessful in his attempt and ended up being taken to Byzantium by his father to be blinded as a punishment for trying to usurp the throne. After some years, Stefan came back to Serbia and begged for his father's forgiveness, which he received. While begging, it was revealed that Stefan did not lose all of his sight, which was interpreted as God giving his own blessing. Soon enough, in the early 14th century, King Milutin would pass away, and Serbia was once more cast into chaos as the crown was given to one of Stefan's cousins rather than to him. Feeling betrayed, Stefan declared himself as king, and civil war broke out. Many people rallied behind Stefan, as they believed that his sight returning meant he was chosen by God. After several years of fighting, Stefan secured the throne and stabilized the country once more. As most of his predecessors, Stefan also had a child, that child being Prince Dusan. Now, Dusan was born prior to the whole civil war fiasco. He spent his early days among his father in Constantinople, while he was banished from the kingdom. There, Dusan would spend his time learning Greek and honing his skills as a warrior. During the civil war, Dusan would lead his father's army and win two major victories, one at the Battle of Hum and another at the Battle of Velbrugd. With such prestige, Dusan grew more confident day by day. Because of this, his father decided to exclude him from his will, which in turn made Dusan usurp the throne and claim Serbia for himself. Now that Dusan was the king of all Serbs, he decided to go ahead and achieve his aspirations, those being expanding his realm. The first thing he did as king was make an alliance with Bulgaria and secure his eastern border. With the threat from a Bulgarian invasion eliminated, Dusan turned his gaze south towards the Byzantine Empire, which was undergoing a civil war themselves. In 1331, Serbia started raiding Macedonia and planning a major offensive. However, those plans had to wait, because just as Serbia had opportunistically attacked the Byzantines, the Hungarians opportunistically attacked the Serbs, as their armies looked south. Initially, the Serbs were defeated by the Hungarians in Šumadija. They pressed south through Serbia through narrow mountain valleys, which Dusan used to his advantage, and sent his cavalry in and decimated the Hungarians, making them retreat all the way back to the Danube. In this offensive, the Hungarian king was wounded, and as a result from his defeat, Hungary lost Machva and Belgrade, which they had controlled over for centuries. However, Serbia did not stop there and continued their offensive west into Bosnia, where they were also victorious with the help of their Bulgarian allies. Upon taming his neighbors in the north, Dusan finally set in motion his plans for the south, and Serbia invaded Byzantium in 1342. In a matter of 5 years, Dusan doubled his territory by exploiting the two warring sides of the Byzantine War and pushed his forces down all the way to the Aegean Sea. At this point, he proclaimed himself as the Emperor of Serbs, Albanians, and Greeks, and with morale at an all-time high, he set his sights for the city of world's desire, Constantinople. For Serbia to take the legendary city, it would need a grand fleet. Thus, Dusan sought to create better ties with the Venetians, who were well known for their naval capabilities. However, with Hungary slowly recovering from its defeat a couple of years ago, Venetian territory in Dalmatia started to get threatened. The Venetians sought Serbian help in defending their territories. However, upon realization that they would obligate themselves in helping taking Constantinople, they changed their minds, as they were skeptical of them gaining anything from Serbia as the new controller of the city. Unsatisfied, Dusan wanted to keep the momentum going and decided to instead turn his focus on Bosnia, where he launched another offensive and secured more territory in the south of the modern-day country. By 1350, the Serbian state looked like this. It spread out to 3 coasts. From then on, it seemed like the sky was the limit for Serbia, and Dusan had many more grand ambitions, such as conquering Constantinople and driving out the Turks from Anatolia. However, only time could tell.
Zasadimo papriku, znate onu žutu, Jednog grba Kamila odmah se pomama.